in that context, I want to point out the digital divide, colleagues. We live in a very unequal, difficult, dangerous world in which rapidly some of the world are advancing, and in terms of social justice, some are not. Some are finding it very, very difficult to get access to technology. Some are finding that actually what I've been talking about in terms of the access to equipment is a dream. And it's a dream that they may not feel that they can ever realize. And that, in terms of social justice, in terms of ICSEI's work, in terms of what I want to talk to you about around the future of young people, is a very important consideration that has brought forward a range of responses already from people in the conference. And I want to note it in particular in terms of digital divide. I want to also raise the issue of unemployment in terms of global youth unemployment. And in the context of digital divide, these are very complex, difficult figures here. But basically, to summarize, the World Economic Forum has noted in terms of increase of digitization that an increase in digitization score of, say, 10% is directly linked to an increase in GDP. In other words, 0.75 per capita. So there's a direct link between access to technology, access to jobs, access to achievement and to success, in kind of monetary terms, access to, if you like, widening one's social opportunities, developing social capital. And I think, therefore, although we can't spend a long time on this, there is a large amount of data that colleagues may find very interesting in terms of that digital divide in ICT infrastructure, because it's not necessarily straightforward, and in different regions of the world it affects us in different ways. But colleagues, it is something that we must not forget. And in that concept, global youth unemployment, percentage of youth ages, Middle East, North Africa, European Union and others, difficulties in terms of young people and basically the struggle to get a job, the struggle to achieve. I wanted to just raise that briefly with you, but also in terms of the rapid development of intelligent computers. I don't know if anybody has been following this debate, but basically computers that will learn. Professor Norio Arai in Japan in the National Institute of Informatics is alerting us to a likely serious aggravation in global unemployment in terms of computers in the future taking over jobs in a large way. Now, this hasn't entered debate very much at all, except in terms of news items and so on, and I wanted to raise it with you because in terms of future planning for education, I think that idea that actually so-called intelligent computers can learn, wonderful opportunities, wonderful things can be done, leisure time opportunities opening up, recreational, educational opportunities opening up, but are we prepared for it? Are we prepared for the rapid advancement in education? Well, sorry, I'm being very critical here, and I'm looking at myself and others in terms of non-response from education and the sense of uncertainty that we have. So Welcome to Uncertainty, established 2008, well, BC actually. And in terms of the sense of uncertainty of what to do with some of these enormous global challenges. And the research questions I wanted to share with you are, firstly, why is e-leadership so lacking? How can we improve digital equity and school pedagogic use of ICT? Why and how? And again, I'm coming back to the notion that Jim was talking to us about in terms of the detail of practice. How does good distributed leadership occur in a living system, and the use of case studies in relation to the sharing of specific local and tacit detailed knowledge? What role does trust have in that, and how is it built and lost? So, in terms of the work on trust, I won't spend too long on that because I need to check how we're doing on timing. We're fine. Okay. So in terms of the work on trust, this citation, surrender yourself humbly, for then you can be trusted to care for all things. And the recognition that humility as a characteristic of leadership in terms of Jim Collins' work and the very best organizations is something that has deeply influenced leadership research and practice. And personally, I actually think it is one of the most important lessons in terms of how people work together in education institutions. And some of the interviews that I have had, I've said to people, what is it that's gone wrong when it's a distrusting environment? And people have said it's about arrogance. It's about when leaders get into a situation and they're not listening to staff and they are not able to acknowledge mistakes, be human, be authentic. There is a difficulty there which is very sharp-edged in terms of how the loss of humility is highly problematic. We are all human beings together, very flawed, and in terms of how we work together, the acknowledgement of that, at no matter what positional level, the acknowledgement of that in terms of distributed leadership, I think, is something very important. So thinking about trust as a relational psychological state in terms of the way that we place faith in others despite our uncertainty, I think in terms of vulnerability of risk, it has been extensively researched. As Karen has noted, there's not that much in terms of education, but it's extensively researched in business environments, in economic environments, and so on. But I think really for us, thinking here today, the notion that it's built, it is built in fact on very well-established foundations in terms of integrity, values-oriented leadership, honesty, and so on, the ways in which moral conduct and emotional intelligence are actually connected with that relational entity, which is a process of trust. And in fact, it's not possible, as we've said in some of the trust and leadership research that I've done, it's really not possible for people to trust in a way on their own. It's a kind of shared entity in most cases. And I think whether we build up trust or mistrust together, and if I point you to Zand's cycle of trust, because Zand has developed a very interesting cycle of trust which is accelerating. In other words, if we trust together, we have a tendency to build more trust together. If we distrust together, we have a tendency to go the opposite direction. I think that is very important in terms of our organizations together. And the inspiring leadership in terms of high trust, to recognize that I think really today few things are more important to school effectiveness than that kind of leadership, which is actually a shared leadership enabling a good educational environment together. I wanted very briefly to talk to you about some of the survey work that I've done on trust, and I've done quite a lot of work for over quite a number of years, including interviews and focus groups and surveys and so on. And this is just a snapshot of some of it because it's just one of the surveys, it's survey number 3, as an example. But actually what's interesting about this that I wanted to raise with you briefly is that no one that I asked said trust wasn't important to them. Now, there's no research that I have done ever which has had 100% response about income. And everybody in that survey, when they were asked other questions, talking about other stuff, basically said many different things and 1,000 responses, and many skipped the question and answered the question differently, and so on. There's a lot of complexity there. But actually, what was interesting is that there's an absolutely universal acknowledgement, I think, from my respondents, of the incredibly important nature of trust, which is why I came to it. And I came to it, in a sense, quite slowly over a number of years, interviewing school leaders and college leaders, where one of the principals that I talked to, I said, what is important to you as a principal about to retire? Because he'd had many years as a successful principal. And he said, it's the way that trust operates. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, it's like a bank. Trust is like a bank. And actually, if you develop that, you can do a lot of work together with staff. And in a sense, he said you could actually do restructuring together. You could draw on that bank of trust. And he said in terms of how students, pupils, felt about the organizations that they were in terms of education, it was very, very important to him that trust was not broken. In other words, that the student felt, the pupil felt, that actually they could trust the environment they were in and that they were not going to be kind of misled, they were not going to be let down. Because as the trust research indicates, when trust is broken, it is very, very difficult to establish. And in the communities of practice work that we have developed, which is a very important issue, the question of the slow growth of trust in communities of practice is something that I wanted to note, is that it's, although there is actually stranger trust in the sense that you can trust somebody immediately, so trust is extremely complex, the slow growth when one is working together is something that's important in comparison, for example, with the very, very rapid and quick loss of trust if there is a breach which has, in a sense, kind of betrayed the person that you are working with or the institution you're working with. So in terms of that, I just wanted to draw to your attention the work of Baroness Honora O'Neill, who did a wonderful BBC Week lecture on the question of trust and delivered that in relation to the accountability and the scrutiny of professionals. I think it is such an important issue, which is that we need more intelligent accountability, she said, and to focus less on grandiose ideals of transparency and more on limiting deception. What she said is, do we really gain from heavy-handed accountability and benefit from indiscriminate demands for transparency? She's unconvinced. She feels that we may undermine professional performance and standards by excessive regulation, by a kind of difficult approach in which we actually are excessively monitoring performance. We may condone, she said, and encourage deception unwittingly in our zeal for transparency. So, what did I say? What did we talked about together in terms of Confucius' words with human beings? Fry little fishes gently, less is sometimes more. In the management of organizations, in the management of living environments, it's important that actually we look after that very delicately and firmly and correctly in a sense. So some of my interviewees had said in a mistrustful policy environment, the protective role of good leaders is important in terms of how you filter out problems and how you protect the people who are working in that environment. And that notion of boundary management as being a main function of the top leader or the top leadership together is to stop negative things, in a sense, coming from outside via corporate bureaucracy as such. And in terms of the way that people from my research described whether they could trust leadership or not, it was a sense that leadership is lacking where there was not a respect, where there was not a kind of underpinning sense of values in terms of the way that people were acting in the organization. So those findings around values-based leadership are very important in terms of high trust. I found that there was a minority of problem in a minority of institutions in terms of a lack of trust, and that tended to be linked to deficits in shared values and a difficult external environment. Now, I just want to check in terms of timing how we're doing today. Now, some very interesting work has been done in terms of organizational models for organizational culture. We can't go into the detail of that now, but I just wanted to recognize with you that the adhocracy culture in terms of openness, creativity, flexibility is important in terms of the kind of ecological environment that we're looking at. Well, I think really where there is a sense that there is a fluid participation which is able to adapt to the environment and which has ambitions, which is also linked to opportunities, where in a sense the kind of rapidity with which people are able to work together in terms of openness and creativity is very important. We have inevitably, and that's what the red arrows are indicating here, inevitably, I'm afraid, we have unintentionally possibly been moving towards hierarchical and market cultures, and I wanted to draw us away from that in terms of saying I think we need to recognize the importance of flexibility and individuality, as well as the well-founded work around hierarchies, which is that as human beings they are essential, we need them. How can we have a balance, colleagues, in terms of the need to respond to the market, in terms of the clan culture, for example, with the family aspects that are important in terms of organisation. So in a sense, we sort of need all of those dimensions really as human entities together, but I argue that actually the openness, the creativity and the flexibility is something that is particularly important in a technology-enabled environment, and that the kinds of leadership behaviours, values-based leadership behaviours, that actually are very strongly linked to integrity and to high standards of moral conduct are important within that. We don't have to be perfect. I mean, it's just not possible for any of us to be so. But actually, in terms of how we respond to mobile growth, to social media, to the challenges upon us in terms of what is at the sharp edge of growth for young people today, in terms of challenges like, for example, the kind of celebrity culture we were talking about, the opportunities for sharing together in terms of social media, there is a fantastic opportunity there. How do we tackle social justice in terms of digital divide and youth unemployment? How do we enable schools to effectively respond to these challenges? Well, what I'm saying, I think it's partly about how together every single person in the organisation, and I personally believe that everybody is a leader, and that actually all of our actions together in a sense are part of, or should be part of, a leadership culture which is driving around school. So what I advise is a balance of invisibility and visibility in terms of walking beside them as regards vision, mission, values, purposes, and also the invisibility of the best leaders in terms of they do not know of their existence, because when the leader's work is done, the people say we did it ourselves, because there is a humility in the leadership which is enabling the growth of leadership in others. And so that sense of humility and delegation, that sense of collaboration, of stepping back to enable group leadership, but at the same time, and I'm reminded of Alma's very interesting book, which I started having a look at yesterday, and we were having a chat about it, because I'm afraid I immediately went to the back leadership section, because that is my tendency to be very interested in what goes wrong there. That is actually partly the key, though, is in terms of that stepping back to enable group leadership, but at the same time monitoring the progress. So it's not laissez-faire. Yeah? It's not, you don't just hand it over to others and kind of let it be, because if you do, what may happen is that the leader may then be kicked out, actually, or there may be a kind of difficult environment which develops, which is actually the standard stops living. So it's not about just kind of letting it go, but it's about what Ruth Silver talked about in terms of distributing discretions. In other words, that throughout the organisation, people have power, and they have shared power together to foster trust. So that paradox in terms of visibility and invisibility, I think that in the future will be vital in terms of how the less is more lessons that we have learned together can enable an effective learning ecology in which school communities thrive in achieving excellent results and outcomes, but within a distributed leadership system, in a sense, where the positional leaders and the emerging leaders are actually working together, and working together in creative and balanced ways that are flexible. So I wanted to just note with you that the more we try to force students to learn, I'm afraid the more anxious they tend to become and the less they learn. I'm afraid that if we attempt to try to make teachers improve against their will, whatever our intentions, And it's not espoused theory of whether something is working. It doesn't always kind of equate to theory in practice, as you know. The more people may resist or retreat. So I think the engagement of colleagues, the winning of hearts, and I'm bringing us back to what my interviewee, who was a wonderful leader, Ruth said. She said, winning hearts. You need to win hearts together in terms of enabling people to improve, to work together to improve, and to share in that, to share the knowledge in that. So we write policies and we write a lot of strategies and we buy a lot of hardware for teachers to use ICT and e-learning in the classroom, but if we do not engage in e-leadership, if we do not share together the important challenges of that, I'm afraid I think the less such plans really work. And there's a huge lesson in terms of the numbers of strategic plans that actually fail. Now, I'm coming towards the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to note to us together that in effective leadership environments, I think it's important that people feel they belong and that they can succeed in a proactively engaged learning community in a well-functioning school system. It's very, very important that people actually feel that they are valued, that they are trusted, that they are respected. And recently, a colleague who has retired, who's been really in education for 50, 60 years, I said to him, what is the thing that was important to you in terms of all of that experience around what's been happening in your lifetime in education? He's only recently retired. He's in his 80s actually, because he's been an emeritus professor and retired 7 times. I think this one is it. But he said, you know, this sense that professionals are not trusted anymore was the most important thing to him. This sense that professionals had actually, despite all of their years of experience, despite all of their knowledge, their passion, their commitment, they had not actually been valued enough to be trusted, and that was terribly important to him. So, colleagues, I argue that in the race to attain visible success in an increasingly competitive environment, a marketized landscape, sometimes more effort through stricter performance accountabilities, regulation and audit achieves less actual learning and achievement. And you cannot fatten a chicken by weighing it, and so on, in terms of how we might cite some proverbs around that. So finally, I wanted to draw to your attention the e-leadership framework that I have drawn up, which I will be aiming to develop and publish in the paper that comes from this conference. The intelligent accountability to district government, for example, the sense of cohesive school vision and the empowerment, the ownership that creative learning innovators together can develop, the sense of an ecological focus in which the many people are engaged in distributed leadership in a school-wide community, the sense of equity and excellence for all is important, I think, in terms of a living focus rather than a machine focus, in terms of a distributed focus rather than a centrist-driven focus in which we actually just let the technical people get on with it. I think it's very important, as a technical person, sometimes myself, that we actually work together to try to ensure that the school vision is not fragmented. There is not a sense of helplessness and fatalism around the challenges which are upon us, and the challenges are difficult, as we have said. But that rigid sense of micro-accountability to district, to government, to local managers, I think can be very disruptive. And so what I draw attention to is the need for a cohesive school vision together, in which that ownership comes forward. So, just drawing to a close now, I wanted to raise to you that in terms of emerging and pedagogical digital innovation, the accelerating growth that is upon us is very, very radically changing the environment which is experienced by pupils, by staff, by schools, by everyone connected with schools. And in terms of online 21st century technologies, I argue that we need to play a more significant role in education in terms of e-leadership than ever before. and that values-based leadership, that trust-building behaviours need to be part of that, that a carefully monitored distributed leadership needs to be part of that, that frying little fishes gently in terms of ecological living systems, in terms of human beings, in terms of intelligent accountability is important, that our strategic sense together of a reflexive culture of management that is unafraid to manage uncertainty is important, and that more research is needed, more practice is needed on leadership and trust in education, as this is only a snapshot. School effectiveness studies then, in terms of those that are focused on the face-to-face, together I would like us to have a sense of shared time and place in recognizing that the online environment in establishing and trusting human communities is very important. And that together, the paradox that less is sometimes more, the way that we work together online, the way that we enable professional practice in terms of the school effectiveness and improvement to, in a liminal zone of disruption which is rapidly taking upon us, whether or not we know it or like it, we are slipping into a different kind of world in which there are very uncertain, disruptive online technologies emerging that are going to change education in unpredictable ways. We do not know what they are yet. As we are here together, we can speculate, and there's some fantastic work being done. And I recognize the absolute brilliance of the learning technologies work, of the pedagogical work, of the innovation, of the e-leadership that is done by good practice exemplars around the world. So when I'm talking about this together, I'm saying I think we need to share that and to share it more widely. But in terms of the rapid recognition of young people and of leading the people we walk beside them in actually enabling people to feel that they did it themselves, my final questions to you are, how do we balance the extroversion tendency with introversion in terms of visibility and visibility? How do we balance character, values-based leadership and trust, the power of quiet, according to a beautiful book recently? How can we balance those tendencies together in terms of education responding to growth, the rapid growth that is upon us? How do we build intrinsic goals together again in a remade world? How can education respond in the best way to e-learning and also e-leadership and ICT data challenges? And so my final questions to you then are addressed with the reference and the thanks to all of the people who've helped me in this work. And just to say, I would like to urge us in ICSEI to recall those wonderful words that were said at the beginning of the conference about how important our schools are in terms of effectiveness and improvement, about how important it is for our young people to achieve the best that they can be.
Jill, that was absolutely amazing. And for those of us who get up early, we would have been in a state of mind, I think, at least partly adequate to be able to absorb the complexity of the presentation. But for those who I think are really challenged by the landscape that you have given us this morning, I just want to begin the question time and comment time. So colleagues, can you get ready with comments or questions? And I'm going to use the Sawazi approach of asking 2 or 3 people to perhaps make comment, raise issues, and then Jill, I can come back to you over the next 20-25 minutes, and perhaps you can respond as you see fit. But if we can get a little bit of dialogue going, that would be fantastic. But I want to go back just as people gather their thoughts. I now understand more clearly the nature of the title. I think for many of us, we